What most people are completely missing about this war is not visible in the missile strikes, not in the diplomatic statements, not in the military updates that dominate the coverage. Everyone is watching the weapons. Almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters most to ordinary people around the world. What is this war doing to the global economy? What does it mean for your job, your food, your energy bills, your savings, your future? And the answer, when examined carefully and analytically, is that this war is not simply a military conflict between America, Israel, and Iran. It is the trigger for the most significant global economic reorientation in decades. Depending on where you live, depending on which side of this reorientation your country falls on, the conditions of ordinary life are about to change in ways that most people have not begun to prepare for. The foundation of everything I want to analyze here is a single observation. The entire global economy for the past 40 to 50 years has been built on one assumption: that cheap energy would always be available, always flowing, always accessible to every nation that needed it. This war is destroying that assumption permanently. The question is no longer whether this will affect the global economy. It already is. The question is which nations will be most devastated by it, and which nations will find a way to survive and even adapt to this new reality. The answer to that question depends entirely on one variable. How dependent is your country on cheap imported energy? The more dependent, the more exposed; the less dependent, the better positioned. That framework is the analytical lens through which every major economy in the world needs to be examined right now. Southeast Asia is not waiting for the economic impact of this war to arrive. It is already here. Thailand and Vietnam are already running out of fuel. At petrol stations in Bangkok and Ho Chi Minh City right now, there is simply no fuel available. People are being forced to work from home, not because they chose to, but because they literally cannot fuel their vehicles to get to work. Jet fuel rationing is producing flight cancellations. Entire industries that depend on energy, manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, are grinding to a halt. And what I observe when I consider what Southeast Asia actually looks like economically is a region whose entire model is built on precisely what is now disappearing. Thailand, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia. These are nations that built their economic identities around manufacturing and exporting goods to the rest of the world. Their factories run on energy. Their supply chains run on energy. Their transport networks run on energy. What is happening now is not a short-term disruption to be managed. It is the beginning of a long-term fundamental change to the conditions under which those economic models were built. China is the most important economic story of this war, and it is not the story most people expect. On the surface, China appears powerful, the world's second largest economy, a rapidly growing military, expanding global influence. But underneath that surface, China is facing an economic vulnerability from this war that could prove more damaging than anything it has encountered in decades. China imports approximately 40% of its total energy needs from the GCC. 40%. That is a massive exposure to exactly the supply chain this war is destroying. And China's entire economic model, the model that generated its wealth over the past 30 to 40 years, is built on importing cheap energy and exporting manufactured goods. Cheap energy in, manufactured goods out. That is the complete architecture of the Chinese economic model. And this war is dismantling that architecture. China recognized this model could not last indefinitely. For the past 20 years, it has been attempting a transition toward a consumer-based economy where Chinese citizens purchase more goods and services domestically, and toward an innovation-based economy built on technology and artificial intelligence. But that transition has not worked. Chinese consumers are refusing to spend. Household savings are running at approximately 40%, meaning Chinese families are holding on to their money rather than circulating it through the economy. The reason is not complicated. Chinese people are not optimistic about their economic future. They see the uncertainty and they are protecting themselves. And the AI transition carries its own structural problem. Artificial intelligence, the technology China is betting its economic future on, is itself dependent on cheap energy. Training AI models, running AI systems, powering the data centers that AI requires, all of it consumes enormous quantities of the very resource that is disappearing. China finds itself caught between an old economic model being destroyed by the energy crisis and a new economic model that is neither functioning as a consumer economy nor viable as a technology economy given the same energy constraints. China is not going to collapse immediately. It still has access to some Iranian oil. It still holds strategic reserves. But in the long term, China is the economy least prepared to adapt to a world of expensive energy. Its entire economic DNA is oriented around cheap energy, and cheap energy is gone. America's situation in this global economic reorientation is structurally different from almost every other major economy. The Western Hemisphere, America, Canada, Mexico, Latin America, is extraordinarily wealthy in natural resources. America has oil, gas, coal, agricultural land, fresh water, timber, and minerals. Everything an economy needs to function, America has within its own hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere is essentially self-sufficient in a way that almost no other comparable economic zone is. This is a significant advantage in a world where global supply chains are breaking down and nations are being forced to rely on their own resources rather than on the integrated international system that made cheap imports possible. America does not have to move its energy through the Strait of Hormuz. It does not have to depend on the GCC for its economic survival. Regardless of the military outcome of this war, America will emerge from it doing reasonably well, not because of its military power, but because of the sheer resource wealth of its own hemisphere. But America is not without risk, and the risk is serious enough to require direct analytical attention. America is carrying $39 trillion in debt. The mechanism that allows it to sustain that debt, the petrodollar system, is under genuine threat. The petrodollar arrangement works as follows. The GCC sells its oil in US dollars. Every nation that needs Gulf energy has to hold US dollars to buy it. That creates permanent global demand for American currency. And the GCC recycles its dollar earnings back into American financial markets. This recycling mechanism is what allows America to borrow $39 trillion and keep functioning. If this war destroys the GCC as a functioning petrodollar anchor, if Gulf states fall under Iranian influence or simply abandon the dollar-denominated oil trade, America loses the financial mechanism that has been sustaining its entire debt-based economic system. That is a serious structural risk. It is not a certainty, but it is a risk that America's resource wealth alone cannot fully insulate against, because the resource advantage addresses the real economy, while the petrodollar risk operates in the financial architecture that sits above it. Africa is the region that most geopolitical coverage of this war is completely ignoring. And what I observe in that omission is a significant analytical failure. Africa is already the most economically vulnerable continent on Earth. Many African nations depend on food and energy imports to sustain their populations. Those imports travel through global supply chains. The same global supply chains this war is disrupting. The worst-case scenario for Africa, the scenario that serious economists and food security specialists are already warning about, is famine. Not food price increases, not food shortages, famine. When global food supply chains break down, when fertilizer becomes unaffordable, when diesel prices make transporting food prohibitively expensive, the nations that suffer most are those with the least economic cushion to absorb those shocks. Africa has the least cushion of any region on Earth. The missiles are falling on Iran. The hunger could arrive in Africa. That asymmetry between where the military violence is occurring and where the humanitarian consequences may be most severe is something that demands attention that it is not currently receiving. India and Pakistan represent two more significant cases of nations caught in the structural disruption this war is producing. India imports approximately 60% of its oil from the GCC. That is an enormous exposure to the supply disruption this conflict is causing. And what makes India's situation particularly significant analytically is the timing. For several years, India has been positioning itself as the world's next great economic power, the fastest growing large economy on Earth, the country that global businesses were looking to as an alternative manufacturing base, a place to build supply chains without depending entirely on China. That positioning was working. India's economy was growing. Foreign investment was flowing in. But with 60% of its energy sourced from the GCC, India now faces the same energy crisis threatening every other Asian economy, at precisely the moment it was ready to step into a larger role in global economic affairs. India's potential is not destroyed by this, but it is seriously complicated, and how India navigates the energy challenge will determine whether it fulfills its economic potential or whether this war delays that ambition by a decade or more. Pakistan is in a more immediately difficult position. It imports the majority of its oil from the GCC, and its economy was already under severe stress before this conflict began. Energy shortages are now arriving on top of existing economic problems. And for ordinary Pakistani families, the impact is reaching them at the worst possible moment, without the buffers that wealthier economies can deploy to absorb the initial shock. Stepping back from individual country analysis and examining the biggest structural picture is where the deepest analytical insight into this war's economic consequences becomes visible. For 40 to 50 years, the global economy has been organized around a very simple arrangement. The West consumes, the East produces. Western nations import cheap manufactured goods from Asian nations. Asian nations import cheap energy from the Gulf to power their factories. This arrangement functioned well as long as two conditions remained stable: cheap energy from the Gulf and reliable global supply chains connecting East and West. This war is destroying both conditions simultaneously. And the insight that most analysis is missing is that both sides of this arrangement are locked into it. Asian nations have built their entire economic identities around production and export. Their factories, their infrastructure, their workforce training, their complete economic DNA is oriented around production for global markets. Now, the cheap energy powering that production is disappearing, and the trade routes carrying those exports to Western consumers are being disrupted. This is a reorientation for everyone, not selectively for the West, not selectively for Asia, but for the entire integrated system that both sides built their prosperity on. The nations that survive this reorientation will be those that adapt fastest, that find new energy sources, build new supply chains, and develop economic models that do not depend on cheap Gulf energy. The nations that fail to adapt, that keep waiting for cheap energy to return, that keep hoping the old economic order will somehow be restored, will fall behind in ways that take generations to recover from. The most surprising economic story of this entire war is the identity of its biggest economic loser. Not Iran, though Iran is being devastated militarily and its economy is collapsing. The biggest economic loser is the GCC itself: Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. These are the nations that will suffer most economically from this war, regardless of how it ends. The GCC nations built themselves on what I can only describe as a mirage. Geographically, the GCC is a desert, vast, hot, waterless, with almost no agriculture, almost no fresh water, and almost no capacity to sustain a large population independently. Under normal circumstances, this desert could support a small population living simply. That is its natural carrying capacity. But the petrodollar and American military protection transformed those constraints entirely. Suddenly, these desert nations had access to nearly unlimited financial resources. They built desalination plants, air-conditioned cities, airports, financial centers, and imported millions of workers from South Asia and Southeast Asia. They created the appearance of a very convincing appearance of modern, prosperous, cosmopolitan nations. Dubai became known as the financial capital of the Middle East, a safe tax haven where wealthy people from around the world could live and invest. The mirage looked absolutely real. But what I observed when I analyzed the structural conditions of the GCC is that the entire construction rested on two external inputs: petrodollar revenue and the security guarantee that American military presence provided. This war is threatening both simultaneously. A few drone strikes on hotels in Dubai, some missile attacks on oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, and suddenly the illusion of safety and stability that the GCC spent decades and trillions of dollars constructing begins to crack. Wealthy people who moved to Dubai for safety are asking whether it is actually safe. Investors who placed money into Gulf real estate and financial markets are asking whether it is actually stable. And once wealthy people and investors arrive at a negative answer to those questions, they leave, and they do not come back. The idea of Dubai as a safe cosmopolitan financial capital competing with London and Singapore. That idea is dissolving. Regardless of how this war ends, regardless of whether a ceasefire comes tomorrow or in 5 years, the GCC will not fully recover the image and the investor confidence that this conflict has already damaged. What I observe across the full arc of this analysis is a global economic transformation that is not arriving gradually. It is arriving now simultaneously across every region and every economic model that was built on the assumptions this war is dismantling. Southeast Asia is already running out of fuel. China's economic model is being structurally undermined. America holds significant advantages but carries serious financial vulnerabilities. Africa faces humanitarian consequences that the world is not adequately preparing for. India's economic ambitions are being complicated at the worst possible moment. Pakistan is absorbing shocks it has no buffer to manage. And the GCC, the geographic and financial foundation of the entire post-war energy order, is watching the mirage it constructed evaporate in real time. The cheap energy world is ending. The global free trade world is fracturing. The American military protection world is contracting. In their place, a new economic order is emerging, one where the nations that possess their own resources, their own energy, their own food production, their own supply chains are positioned to survive and adapt. And the nations that built their prosperity on cheap, imported everything face an adjustment whose depth and duration will be determined by how quickly they recognize that the conditions that made that model work are not returning. The question is not whether this reorientation is coming. It is already here. The question is whether the governments managing these economies and the individuals living inside them are prepared to respond to a world that has already changed. And that question of preparedness is not abstract. It is immediate, practical, and personal in a way that most economic analysis fails to communicate. Because what I observe in the historical record of major economic reorientations, and there have been several across the past century, each one reshaping the conditions of ordinary life in ways that seemed unthinkable before they arrived, is that the people and institutions that navigate them successfully are rarely those with the most resources at the starting point. They are those who recognized earliest that the old conditions were gone permanently and stopped waiting for them to return. The psychological difficulty of that recognition should not be underestimated. Economies, governments, and individuals are all built around expectations that the near future will resemble the recent past. When those expectations are invalidated by structural change of the kind this war is accelerating, the instinct is to treat the disruption as temporary, to absorb the initial shock and wait for normalization. That instinct is understandable. It is also, in conditions of genuine structural transformation, the most dangerous response available. What this war has done to the global economy is not produce a disruption after which normalization follows. It has accelerated the arrival of a new set of baseline conditions for energy, for trade, for security, for the financial architecture that connects all three. Those conditions are not going to revert. The nations and individuals who act on that understanding now, rather than waiting for evidence that becomes undeniable only when the adjustment cost has already compounded, are the ones who will determine what the next economic order looks like and who benefits from it. The historical precedents for what I am describing here are instructive precisely because they were not recognized as turning points while they were occurring. The end of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 did not announce itself as a civilizational economic shift. The oil shock of 1973 was initially treated as a temporary supply disruption that would resolve itself once political conditions normalized. The collapse of the Soviet economic model was visible in its structural indicators years before it became visible in its political consequences. In each case, the analytical failure was the same. The assumption that a system under pressure would find a way to restabilize around its existing architecture rather than collapse into a fundamentally different one. What I observe in the current moment is that same analytical failure operating at global scale. The pressure on the cheap energy system, on the petrodollar architecture, on the integrated global supply chain model that connected Gulf energy to Asian production, to Western consumption. That pressure is not temporary, it is structural. And the war that is accelerating it is not creating conditions that did not previously exist. It is destroying the conditions that prevented those vulnerabilities from becoming visible. The architecture was already fragile. The war is simply the event that is making that fragility impossible to continue ignoring. What comes next will be built on different foundations. The only remaining question is who builds it and on whose terms.